This is the outcome of chaos. And at the back of all this is Trump's determination to try and get a deal and stop the fighting. That is laudable. But the way they're going about it is completely chaotic, as far as I can see.
So, what do you think happened back whenever this first broke? With Steve Witkoff bringing out this 28-point plan that effectively seemed to be a Chat GPT translation of the Russian proposals that have always been on the table, and then we get Marco Rubio turning around saying, no, this was Russian, we haven't produced it. And then only a few hours later, having to turn around and say, no, this is something that we've drafted. And then Donald Trump coming out with the same rhetoric he did whenever Zelensky was ambushed in the Oval Office, and turning around and blaming Ukraine for starting a war that they knew they couldn't win, and not being grateful to the United States. You've been in diplomatic circles. What did you make of that whole circus? Is probably the right way to describe it from my perspective.
I think circus is a pretty good way to describe it. I mean, I think this shows the complete dysfunctionality of the American system. So my own guess as to what happened is that Steve Witkoff, fresh from his triumph in blustering through a negotiated solution, at least a ceasefire in Gaza, tried to use the same tactics here on Ukraine. I think most of the substance was Russian, and most of the tactics were Witkoff, who thought again that he would get, a big, broad package, slap it on the table, and then try and hustle through agreement in 2 or 3 days using Trump's power. I mean, Trump said, we'll do it by Thanksgiving Day on Thursday this week. So I think the Gaza gambit was what he was trying, and it didn't work because this is not Gaza. The Americans don't have anything like the leverage that they had over Israel on Gaza. Ukraine is not smashed to pieces as Hamas was in Gaza. And so that's what I think happened. And because it was dysfunctional, I think this was Witkoff freelancing. And when it got to the State Department and Marco Rubio, he knew perfectly well Ukrainians wouldn't be able to agree. So I think this is the outcome of chaos. And at the back of all this is Trump's determination to try and get a deal and stop the fighting. That is laudable. But the way they're going about it is completely chaotic, as far as I can see.
So, one of the comments that came out of, I think it was the 28-point plan, and in the 24-point plan, was bringing Russia back into the international fold again, with being brought back into the G8, and therefore that was giving the impression that there'd be a reset and everything would go back to normal, and Russia would continue to play a sensible international global presence and global role as a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations and member of the G8 and everything else. But do you think that is a realistic proposition, or are they just going to use this as a pause point for them to then accelerate whatever it is they're planning for the future?
I don't think it's a realistic proposition, except right at the very end of the process. I mean, it seems to me it's a carrot dangled to the Russians. If you get all the way through to the end of the process, if there is a peace settlement, if it sticks, if you are becoming, a reasonable member of the international community, if you are paying reparations towards the damage you've done in Ukraine, repatriating the Ukrainian children that have been taken to Russia, well, then at that point, we'd be prepared to sort of bring you back into international councils, including the G7, to make it G8. But just only right at the end of the process, I think. I don't think there's any intention of doing that until there's a really demonstrated evidence that the Russians are serious about striking and then implementing a peace settlement.
But again, bringing things, the Russians back in again, and having read through what was reported to be part of that initial proposal, it was very lacking in substance. And when you drill into the substance that's behind a lot of the issues, it makes it almost impossible, because the de facto recognition of Russia having taken the Donetsk region is something that's contrary to the United Nations United Nations legislation on taking land by force. Donald Trump turning around saying this must be signed or I'm going to cut off all aid by Thanksgiving and all the rest of it is against another convention talking about coercion. And then when we talk about Putin coming back into, or Russia coming back to join the G7 and reform the G8, that hasn't taken the international arrest warrant away from him. And I know the United States doesn't recognize the International Criminal Court, so he'd be fine if there were G8 meetings in the US. But if there are G8 meetings in the UK or Germany or France, we would be duty bound to arrest him and send him off to The Hague. And none of that seems to have been thought through. Do you think it was a very naive set of proposals?
Well, I think it was basically a Russian wish list. And so for all those reasons, yes, I think it reflected a maximalist Russian position, all kinds of problems with it. The ones you identify, there's no way that the international community are going to accept that Russia gets sovereignty over the territory in Ukraine it's conquered. That would be completely against the UN Charter, as you say. Things like NATO, it's not for the US and Russia to rule out that Ukraine might one day join NATO, write it into its law, which I think is what the document said. There was an airy assumption that EU membership for Ukraine was on the agenda and they'd get preferential access to the EU market. Well, that was news to the EU. So on and on it goes. It was full of airy assumptions and basically, that what the Russians wanted as something that they could justify for ending the war, because Putin's problem is, unless he ends the war with a settlement, which is clearly a decisive victory for Russia, he's got an enormous reckoning at home for the million or so Russians who've been killed or badly wounded in the war so far. And I'm sure that's in his mind as well. I think he'd much rather go on fighting than settle for a deal which, was a fair deal for Ukraine.
So with all of that in context, and we had that Witkoff saying one thing, Rubio saying another, then Rubio changing his mind again, then Trump coming out. What does that say about the, and you may want to change my wording in this, but competence of the US administration that is looking at this and the way they're handling it? Does that give us an idea that they are competent in dealing with it, or should we just recognize that they're way out of their depth?
Well, I think the way Trump governs, as far as I can see, is by keeping competing camps around him and then reserving to himself the right to choose the one that's uppermost that day. And so I think he cultivates competition among his the people around him, with people vying for his goodwill and his approbation. And so I think it's entirely in keeping that Steve Witkoff went into one corner and negotiated with the Russians a text, and then that was leaked probably by the Russians, I should think, and then other parts of the American system, State Department and so on, reacted against that and set up a separate negotiation in Geneva to try and put things back on. So I think dysfunctional is my word, and consciously so, I think deliberately so by Trump. I think that's how he enjoys governing, and therefore this constant tension and constant competition around him, and allows him to be the arbiter at the end of the day. And it makes the Americans very complex to deal with, because you don't know whether you're dealing with Rubio or with Vance or with Witkoff, who's got the upper hand at the moment. And I think it was Donald Tusk, the Polish president, who tweeted to say early on in this saga that he was very willing to have a negotiation, but he wanted to know where the 28 points had come from. And that's, it's a very good question. Yeah, this is a very different sort of American administration to any that I've ever worked with. They're usually very disciplined, very organized. They arrive at meetings having had long consultations and coordination in their NSC structure, with detailed instructions, long talking points that they've all agreed. And they can be very effective negotiators like that. That's how you get things like the Dayton peace agreement that brought the Bosnia war to an end. I think we've just celebrated the 30th anniversary of that. That was an American peacemaking deal which took months of hard negotiation, a long, detailed text thrashed out with all the partners. We're a million miles from that here, and yet the Ukraine war is even more difficult to settle than the Bosnian war was.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.